Lena stood at the front of the operations room, her notes in perfect order, her voice steady but low, just enough to be heard over the hum of shifting gear and boots against tile. The SEAL team had gathered not by her request, but because protocol required it. Her job was intelligence analysis, and the mission briefing was hers to lead, though no one in that room seemed ready to listen to her. The room was full of decorated men, trained killers, warriors who had spent years trusting only each other, and Lena was not one of them. She was new not to the agency, but to this level of access, and it showed in the way they sat, arms crossed, legs wide, jaws set, waiting for her to mess up. She began anyway, walking them through the satellite images. The pattern shifts, the intercepted comms, it was textbook work, solid, accurate, built on weeks of sleepless nights and early mornings. But halfway through the second slide, one of them snorted softly, then said, "We already know this," and she paused for a breath, knowing what was happening, knowing that this was not about the data or the mission. This was about her presence, her voice, her right to speak. She looked up at the man who had interrupted him and nodded once before continuing, but the murmurs had started, and within moments to others were whispering to each other. One stifled a laugh, and Lena felt her pulse rising. Still, she kept speaking, detailing the terrain, the escape routes, the risk profile, and finally the trap that no one else had seen, the detail buried in the frequency spike that she had pulled out from a broken data stream. It meant the op site was compromised, and walking in without adjustment could cost them lives. She stepped closer to the screen, prepared to explain the recalibrated plan, when the same voice said again, "We've heard enough." But this time, before she could answer, another voice cut through the room, clear, calm, with weight behind it, and it said, "Let her finish." Everything stopped, heads turned, chairs shifted, and Lena saw the speaker. It was Commander Rios, the mission lead, a man whose word carried the weight of experience and authority. He had not spoken once during the briefing, just listened from the back, arms folded, eyes locked on her, and now he had spoken, and the room fell quiet. Lena did not move for a second, then turned back to her screen and kept going. No anger, no tremble, just the facts, the patterns, the adjusted timeline, the extraction window, and by the time she was done, no one said anything. Not a breath out of Placide powered down the screen, gathered her notes, and left the room without looking back, because she had done her job, and now they knew it too, even if they would never admit it, not with words, but their silence was enough. Mission moved forward exactly as she laid it out, and when the team deployed, Lena stayed behind at base, watching every satellite feed, every audio channel, her eyes never leaving the monitors, her fingers moving over the keyboard with the same calm rhythm she had carried in the briefing room. There was no time to think about the silence that had followed her presentation, no space to wonder if they respected her now, because what mattered was that the information was correct, and that it could save lives. Commander Rios checked in every 15 minutes, his voice short and efficient, always asking for the next update, never questioning her tone or her calls. And as the hours dragged on, Lena felt the pressure tighten, not out of fear, but because she knew what it meant to miss something. She knew what it felt like to have someone pay for a detail overlooked. She had lived through that before, years ago in her first field rotation, when a misread signal led to an ambush, and operatives never came home. That was the night she decided she would never let it happen again, that she would be the one in the shadows behind the screens, seeing what others missed, even if they never knew her name. And so she sat there, alert, focused, running calculations, measuring sound spikes, filtering heat signatures, until finally the call came through. The target had been located just where she predicted, not in the center of the marked structure, but in the secondary chamber, masked by a false thermal layer, just as she had warned. They moved in quickly, taking the objective without casualties and pulling out through the narrow canyon route she had designated days before. It was clean, it was sharp, it was done. And when the dust settled, Lena leaned back in her chair for the first time in hours, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She did not smile, she did not cheer, she simply recorded the result, closed the file, and moved on to her next report, because that was the job, and she was good at it. Later that evening, as the team returned and debriefed, she passed them in the hallway on her way to the analysis room. A few nodded, a couple muttered thanks, but mostly they just looked at her, not with challenge, Not with pity, just with quiet recognition, the kind that came when men who lived by results saw someone who delivered, and for Lena that was more than enough. She did not need applause, she did not need to be liked, she needed the data to be right. And the mission to come home, and both had happened. Commander Rios found her later that night in the dim light of the ops center and stood silently for a few seconds before setting a sealed envelope beside her terminal. Inside was a commendation. Short and direct, signed by him and the regional commander. It wasn't public, it wasn't posted, but it was real, and Lena folded it slowly and placed it in her case without a word. Then she turned back to her screen, ready for the next mission already. Scanning for the next 3 weeks passed, and Lena continued her work in the shadows of the operations center. Her name appeared on more reports, her fingerprints on more successful missions, but still she kept to herself, her desk always spotless. Her screens filled with data streams, while the rest of the base pulsed with the noise and energy of those who thrived in chaos. She thrived in precision. She was the one who connected dots that no one else could see, who found patterns in static and threats buried beneath silence. She rarely spoke unless it was necessary, and when she did, it was always with clarity, always with facts, never emotion. On morning, she was called into a special briefing early before sunrise, the hall still quiet. The sky outside barely gray. She walked into a room with only 3 people: Commander Rios, Colonel Hensley, and a man she had never seen before, dressed in civilian clothing but with the posture of someone who had worn rank. The man introduced himself simply as Mason and handed her a classified file that detailed a growing series of coordinated ambushes on Allied convoys across a remote valley region. Each attack seemed random on the surface, different times, different terrain, different methods. But Lena saw it within minutes. She saw the rhythm, the clockwork beneath the violence, and she told them it was not random at all. She explained that the enemy had a signal path buried in the communication spectrum, masked by civilian interference, bouncing off mountain ranges and mimicking harmless chatter, but if decoded it revealed movement, timing, drop locations, and ambush setups. It was elegant, brutal, and deeply hidden. Mason watched her speak without interruption, his eyes fixed on the screen behind her, and when she finished, he only said one word: impressiver. The next, for days, Lena worked with a small mobile team, decoding transmissions, isolating movement patterns, and mapping out the entire network behind the ambushes. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind focused like a lens, cutting through layers of deception, and when she finally cracked the central node, she realized the group behind it was operating under a stolen signature from an allied unit, meaning every message they sent appeared to be friendly, and every order they gave looked legitimate, until it was. Latesh presented her findings to Mason and Rios in a room filled with silence. No one questioned her math, no one doubted the conclusion, and for the first time she felt the shift: not just silence or reluctant respect, but trust earned, not given, and with it came responsibility. They asked her to accompany the response team, not on the ground, but in the mobile command unit closer to the field than she had ever been before. She said yes without hesitation, not for recognition, not for pride, but because this time the risk was greater, the enemy smarter, and she knew that if she was not there, something might be missed, something that only she would catch, and that was unacceptably so. She packed her bag, loaded her data cores, and boarded the transport without looking back. The mobile command unit was a tight space, humming with low voices, quiet clicks, and the steady rhythm of machines breathing data into darkness. Lena sat in the center, surrounded by operators who monitored field cameras, audio feeds, and telemetry. But it was her hands that shaped the decisions, her eyes that picked out the anomalies, and her voice that cut through when something was wrong. The team on the ground moved through the valley in silence under her direction, each step guided by hours of analysis, every path calculated against enemy patterns she had mapped like veins under skin. It was different being this close, hearing the tension in the voices, watching the terrain shift in real time, feeling the weight of every call she made. Every time she said hold or move, or now, it carried consequence, the kind measured in seconds and blood. Yet her voice never shook, her hands never paused, because this was where she belonged, in the middle of the storm, not to be seen but to see everything. And make it matter on the second night, an anomaly appeared just off the expected route, a flicker in infrared, a shadow where none should be, and Lena leaned in, fingers flying over her keyboard, overlaying maps, shifting spectrums, filtering noise, until it appeared a hidden outpost dug into the ridge mast by elevation and thermal shielding, the perfect vantage point for a surprise assault. She pinged Rios immediately. The field team halted just short of walking into range, and as the new plan formed, Lena rerouted their path, guiding them through narrow terrain under cover of night until they circled the enemy silently, efficiently, completely. It followed was a coordinated breach, 3 teams moving in tandem under complete blackout, extracting intel, neutralizing threats, and pulling back before the enemy could regroup. Lena watched every moment, every signal, until the last man was out, and then finally she allowed herself to blink back in the command unit. Mason looked at her without speaking, then simply nodded and walked out. He never gave praise, and she never needed it. What mattered was that the team returned and that their data confirmed everything she had predicted. But things shifted after that. Her name began to appear in new channels. Quiet commendations from people who mattered, her reports requested by other divisions. Her voice now carried weight, not because of rank, but because of proof, and still she stayed behind the glass, behind the screens, choosing precision over attention. Silence over applause. That night, alone in the command unit, Lena reviewed footage from the breach, not out of pride, but to study what could have gone wrong, where timing had cut to close, where risk had flickered. She took notes, she made improvements. Because perfection was never the goal, but responsibility was, and she carried it alone and far away across the base in a room full of men who once mocked her silence. The same SEALs now reviewed her notes word by word, listening not because they were told to, but because they knew she saw what they could not, and they trusted her without needing to say it. Next mission came faster than anyone expected. A high-value target linked to the ambush network had surfaced in a village to quiet, to still a place that seemed untouched by war, yet leaked whispers of movement, weapons, funding, and encrypted signals. The order came down sudden and sharp: full strike team insertion. Lena was brought in before the mission window even finalized. Because this time they did not want to report, they wanted her, they needed her on the comms and the decisions and the heartbeat of the operation. She studied the terrain for hours, watching wind maps, cloud coverage, heat signatures that flickered in and out like candlelight. There were details that made her uneasy, shadows that moved too smoothly, echoes in the spectrum that felt shaped, not natural. She flagged them all, built risk profiles, cross-referenced recent drone footage, and then it hit her. The village was bait, carefully arranged like a perfect trap. The communications were to clean, to obvious, planted to draw in a response. Lena built the scenario in real time, and when the brass reviewed it, they saw the same truth: to clean meant to easy, and to easy meant someone was waiting. They adjusted the mission plan, Lena guiding every adjustment, every new angle, every countermeasure. She rerouted the insertion point, moved the secondary team through the dry riverbed, recommended silent drone cover and thermal jamming to throw off watchers from the ridgeline. Every detail mattered, every second counted, and when the night came and boots hit the ground, Lena was already in place inside the mobile unit. Screens, a live voice, calm hands steady of everything unfolded with sharp control. The team moved in slow and deliberate, avoiding every trip point Lena had marked, bypassing the thermal lures and false heat decoys that would have pulled them into a kill zone. Instead, they reached the target compound untouched, and Lena picked up the final signal, a relay burst from the main building. Just before entry, she paused for half a second, rechecked the frequency, and confirmed it was a remote detonation trigger wired to the back room. She rerouted the breach order just in time. The charge went off harmlessly, burning the room. They had never entered. The extraction was clean, fast, efficient, and the target was captured alive with a drive full of enemy plans and funding networks. Lena sat back only when the bird was in the air, only when every call sign checked in safe, and only then did she unclench her hands. Mason called in over the secure line, said nothing at first, then told her that without her they would have walked into A grave, and that she should be told that even if she would not ask to hear it later. As the sun rose over the base, Lena walked past the SEAL team again. This time, not a single one looked through her. They looked at her, each nod carrying a weight more than words, and Rios gave her a small salute. No ceremony, no speech, just a gesture between warriors who had seen the same fire from different fronts. The war shifted, but Lena remained at her post, not because she was tied to a single conflict, but because she had become essential to something larger, something more precise and enduring than any battlefield. Commanders now requested her by name. Teams refused to deploy without her eyes on their route, and intelligence units rerouted streams of raw data directly to her console, because over time the quiet woman with no rank on her collar had become the one they trusted when trust meant the difference between returning home and vanishing without trace. One afternoon during a storm that rattled the outer base walls, an unfamiliar knock came at her door. A young recruit stood there, wide-eyed and unsure, holding a stack of encrypted files, stammering that he had heard about her and wanted to learn how she saw what others missed. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once and let him inside, not because she sought recognition or legacy, but because she remembered what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated, and how many lives could be saved if just one more person learned to see clearly. Over the following months, Lena quietly mentored 3 others, none with her speed or instinct, yet all sharp, willing to learn. She taught them to read beyond the numbers, to hear the silence between signals, to feel when something was off even if the math said everything was fine. And slowly they formed a new layer of defense, a silent ring of watchers trained to detect the undetectable, shaped by the one who spoke little but saw all. Meanwhile her reputation grew, though she never asked for it. Generals would pause when she entered a room. Foreign allies sought her analysis more than their own, and the SEAL teams now carried her diagrams folded into their gear, watermarked with a single code word, her name. One day during a coalition summit, she was invited to present an after-action report to a room filled with men who once might have dismissed her presence, and as she stepped up to the podium, she noticed the room quiet, the kind of quiet that does not demand attention but offers it, and someone in the back stood tall and simply said, "Let her finish," before she even began, and no one interrupted her. On afterward, she returned to her work, unchanged, unmoved by praise. But that night in the empty ops center, she reached into the side pocket of her case and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the first commendation she ever received, the one signed by Rios and the regional commander long ago. She smoothed it flat and placed it inside a small frame tucked into the corner of her desk where no one could see it but her. It was not for pride, but for memory, for the weight of what it cost to be heard and the silence she had to break to earn it. And now when she spoke, no one talked over her, no one doubted her, and no one ever forgot the day the room went still and someone said, "Let her finish."